The Vanishing Glass, Chapter 2. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on their front steps, but Privet Drive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the tidy front gardens and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been the night when Mr. Dursley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago, there had been lots of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing different colors of bonnets. But Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby, and now the photograph showed a large blond boy riding his first bicycle on a carousel at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed by his mother. The room had no signs at all that another boy lived in the house too. Yes, Harry Potter was still there. He was asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and with her shrill voice that made the first noise of the day. "Up! Get up now!" Harry woke with a start. His aunt rapped the door again. "Up!" she screeched. Harry heard her walking around the kitchen, and then the sound of the frying pan being put on the stove. He rolled onto his back and tried to remember the dream he was having. It had been a good one. There had been a flying motorcycle in it. He had a funny feeling that he had the same dream before. His aunt was back outside the door. "Are you up yet?" she demanded. "Nearly," said Harry. "Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon. And don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect for Dudley's birthday." Harry groaned. Ugh. "What'd you say?" snapped his aunt through the door. Nothing. Dudley's birthday. How could I have forgotten? Harry got slowly out of bed, started looking for socks. He found a pair under his bed and pulling off a spider on one of them, but put them on. Harry was used to spiders because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that is where he slept. When he dressed, he went down the hall to the kitchen. The table was almost hidden underneath Dudley's birthday presents. It looked as though Dudley had gotten the new computer he wanted, not to mention the second television and the racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise, unless, of course, it involved punching somebody. Dudley's favorite punching bag was Harry, but he couldn't often catch Harry. Harry didn't look it, but Harry was very fast. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that the dark cupboard, but Harry always seemed small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was, because all he had to wear were old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobby knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of Scotch tape because all of the times Dudley had punched him in the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar above his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he'd gotten the scar. "In the car crash when your parents died," she said. "And don't ask questions." Don't ask questions? That was the first rule for a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry was turning over the bacon. "Comb your hair," he barked, by way of morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted that Harry needed a haircut. Harry must have had more haircuts than the rest of the boys in his class put together, but it made no difference. The hair simply grew that way, all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked a lot like Uncle Vernon. He had a large pink face, not much of a neck, small watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that lay smoothly on its thick, fat head. Aunt Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often said that Dudley looked like a pig in a wig. Harry put the plates of eggs and bacon on the table, which was difficult, as there was not much room. Dudley, meanwhile, was counting the presents. His face fell. 36? He said, looking at his mother and father. "That's 2 less than last year." Darling, you haven't counted Aunt Margie's present, see? Isn't it here under the big one from Mummy and Daddy? All right, 37 then, said Dudley, going in the red in the face. Harry, who could see huge Dudley tantrum coming on, began wolfing down his bacon as fast as possible in case Dudley turned the table over. Aunt Petunia obviously scented danger too, because she said quickly, "And we'll buy you another 2 presents when we're out today. How's that, Popkin? 2 more presents? Is that all right?" Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like a hard work. Finally, he said slowly, "So I'll have 39, sweetums," said Aunt Petunia. "Oh." Dudley sat up heavily and grabbed the nearest parcel. "All right, then," Uncle Verno chuckled. "Little tyke wants his money worth. That's like his father. Attaboy, Dudley." He ruffled Dudley's hair. At the moment, the telephone rang and Aunt Petunia went to answer it while Harry and Uncle Henry watched Dudley unwrap his racing bike, his video camera, his remote control airplane, 16 new computer games, a VCR. He was ripping off the paper off the gold wristbands and Aunt Petunia came back from the telephone looking both angry and worried. "Bad news, Vernon," she said. "Mrs. Figgs broke her leg. He can't take him." She jerked her head towards Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and a friend out for the day to an adventure park, hamburger restaurants, or the movies. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mrs. Figg, a mad old lady who lived in 2 streets away. Harry hated it there. The whole house smelled of cabbage. Mrs. Figg made him look at photographs of all the cats she'd ever owned. "Now what?" said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry as though he had planned this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Figg had broken her leg, but it wasn't easy when he was reminded himself of the whole year before he had to look at Tibbles and Snowy and Mr. Paws and Tufty again. "We could phone Marge," Uncle Vernon suggested. "Oh, don't be silly, Vernon. She hates the boy." Dursleys often spoke of Harry like this, as though he wasn't even there. Or rather, as though he was something very nasty that couldn't understand, like a slug. "What about what's-her-name, your friend Yvonne?" "On vacation in Majorca," snapped Petunia. "You could just leave me here," Harry put hopefully. He'd be able to watch what he wanted on television for a change, and maybe even have a go at Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia looked at him as though she swallowed a lemon. "And come back to find the house in ruins," she snarled. "I won't blow up the house," said Harry. But they weren't listening. "I suppose we could take him to the zoo," said Aunt Petunia, "and we could leave him in the car." "That car's a new car. He's not sitting in it alone." Dudley began to cry loudly. In fact, it wasn't really crying. It had been years since he really cried, but he knew what if he screwed up his face and wailed, his mother would give him anything he wanted. "Oh, Dinky Dudley Doodums, don't cry. Mommy won't let him spoil your special day," she cried, flinging her arms around him. "I don't want him to come," Dudley yelled between huge pretend sobs. "He always spoils everything." He shot Harry a nasty grin through the gap of his mother's arms. Just then the doorbell rang. "Oh, good Lord, they're here," said Aunt Petunia frantically. A moment later, Dudley's best friends, Piers Polkiss, walked in with his mother. Piers was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their backs while Dudley hit them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once. Half an hour later, Harry couldn't believe his luck. He was in the back of the Dursleys' car with Miss Piers and Dudley on the way to the zoo. For the first time in his life, his aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything to do with him. But before they left, Uncle Vernon took Harry aside. "I'm warning you," he said, putting his large purple face right up to Harry's. "I'm warning you, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in that cupboard from now until Christmas." "I'm not going to do anything," said Harry. "Honestly." But Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No one ever did. The problem was very strange things often happened around Harry, and it just was no good telling the Dursleys he didn't make them happen. Once Aunt Petunia tired of Harry coming back from the barber's looking as though he hadn't been at all, and took a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short that it was almost bald, except for his bangs, which left to hide that horrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, who spent a sleepless night imagining school the next day. We had already been laughed at for his baggy clothes and taped glasses. Next morning, however, he gotten up to find his hair exactly as it had been before. Aunt Petunia had sheared it off, and it had been given a week in the cupboard for this, even though he had tried to explain that he couldn't explain how his hair had gotten back so quickly. Another time, Aunt Petunia had been trying to force him into a revolting old sweater of Dudley's, brown with orange puffballs. The harder she tried to pull over his head, the smaller it seemed to become, and finally it might have fitted a puppet, but certainly couldn't fit Harry. Aunt Petunia had decided it must have shrunk in the wash. To his relief, Harry wasn't punished. On the other hand, he had gotten into terrible trouble for being found on the roof of the school kitchens. Dudley's gang had been chasing him as usual. When, as much to Harry's surprise as anyone else, he was sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys had received a very angry letter from Harry's headmistress telling them that Harry had been climbing the school buildings. But all he tried to do, as he shouted at Uncle Vernon through the locked door of the cupboard, was jump behind the big trash cans outside the kitchen door. Harry supposed the wind must have caught him in mid-jump. But today nothing was going wrong. It was even worth being with Dudley and Piers by spending the day somewhere that wasn't school, his cupboard, or Mrs. Figg's cabbage-smelling living room. While he drove, Uncle Henrik complained to Aunt Petunia as he was complaining about things that people at work, Harry, the council, Harry, the bank, Harry, were just a few of his favorite subjects. This morning it was motorcycles. Roaring along like maniacs, young hoodlums, he said as a motorcycle overtook them. I had a dream about a motorcycle, Harry said, remembering suddenly. It was flying. Uncle Vernon nearly crashed into the car in front of him. He turned right around in his seat and yelled at Harry in his face like a gigantic beat with a mustache. Motorcycles don't fly! Dudley and Piers sniggered. I know they don't, said Harry. It was only a dream. But he wished he had said nothing. If there were one thing the Dursleys hated even more than asking questions, was talking about anything, acting in a way that shouldn't be, no matter if it was a dream or even a cartoon. They seemed to think he might get dangerous ideas. It was a very sunny day at the zoo, crowded with families. The Dursleys brought the Dudley and Piers and large chocolate ice creams at the entrance, and then because the smiling lady in the van asked if Harry what he wanted before they could hurry him away, they bought him a cheap lemon ice pop. Wasn't bad, either, Harry thought, licking it as they watched the gorilla scratching his head, who looked remarkably like Dudley, except it wasn't blonde. Harry had the best morning he'd had in a long time. He was careful to walk a little way apart from the Dursleys so that Dudley and Piers, who were starting to get bored with the animals by lunchtime, wouldn't fall back on their own favorite hobby of hitting him. They ate in the zoo restaurant where Dudley had a tantrum because his Knickerbocker glory didn't have enough ice cream on top. Uncle Vernon bought him another one, and Harry was allowed to finish the first. Harry felt afterward that he should have known it was all too good to last. After lunch, there was a reptile house. It was cool and dark in there, with lit windows all along the walls behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes crawling and slithering over bits of wood. Dudley and Piers wanted to see the huge poisonous cobras and thick man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found the larger snake in the place. It could have wrapped around his body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a trash can. But at the moment, it didn't look like it was in a mood. In fact, it was fast asleep. Dudley stood there with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. Make it move, he whined to his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass. The snake didn't move. Do it again, Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass smartly with his knuckles. The snake just snoozed at him. This is boring, Dudley moaned. He sniffled away. Harry moved in front of the tank, looked intently at the snake. He would have been surprised if he died of boredom itself. No company, except stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass, trying to disturb him all day. It was worse than living in a cupboard as a bedroom, where only visitor was Aunt Petunia hammering on the door to wake you up, or at least he got to visit the rest of the house. The snake suddenly opened his eyes, slowly, very slowly. It raised his head until its eyes were level with Harry. It winked. Harry stared, then looked quickly around to see if anyone was watching. They weren't. He looked back at the snake and he winked too. The snake jerked his head towards Uncle Dudley, then raised his eyes to the ceiling to give Harry a look that said, quite plainly, I get that all the time. I know, Harry murmured through the glasses, though he wasn't sure the snake could hear him. It must be really annoying. The snake nodded vigorously. Where'd you come from, anyway? Harry asked. The snake jabbed his little sign into the glass and appeared. Boa constrictor, Brazil. Was it nice there? The boa constrictor jabbed his tail at the sign again. The specimen was bred in the zoo. Oh, I see. So you've never been to Brazil? The snake shook its head. Deafening shout behind Harry made both of them jump. Dudley! Mr. Dursley, come and look at the snake. You won't believe what it's doing. Dudley came waddling towards them as fast as he could. Out of the way, you! He said, punching Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell hard on the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast that no one saw how it happened. 1 second, Piers and Dudley were leaning right up close to the glass. Next, they had leapt back with their howls of horror. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass in the front of the sea of the boa constrictor's tank vanished. The great snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithering onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exits. As the snake slid swiftly past Harry, he could have sworn he heard a low hissing sound. Brazil, here I come. Thanks, amigo. The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. But the glass, he kept saying. Where'd the glass go? The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong sweet tea. While he apologized over and over, Piers and Dudley could only gibber. As far as Harry had been, the snake hadn't done anything except snap playfully at their heels. As it passed out, by the time they were all back in Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Piers was swearing it had squeezed him to death. But worst of all, for Harry at least, was when Piers calming down enough to say, Harry was talking to it, weren't you, Harry? Uncle Vernon waited until Piers safely was out of the house before starting it on Harry. He was so angry he could barely speak. He just managed, Go! Cupboard! Stay! No meals! Before he collapsed into his chair, Aunt Petunia had run and get him a large brandy. Harry lay in his dark cupboard, much later wishing he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was, and he couldn't be sure the Dursleys were asleep. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking out to the kitchen for some food. He lived with the Dursleys almost 10 miserable years, as long as he could remember, and ever since he'd been a baby and his parents had died in that car crash, he couldn't remember being in the car with his parents when they had died. Sometimes he had a strained memory of during long hours in his cupboard. He came up with a strange vision, a blinding flash green light and a burning pain in his forehead. This, he supposed, was the crash, though he couldn't imagine where all the green light came from. He couldn't remember the parents at all. His aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course he was forbidden to ask questions. There were no photographs of them in the house. When he had been younger, Harry had dreamed and dreamed of some unknown relation coming to take him away, but it had never happened. The Dursleys were his only family. Yet sometimes he thought, or maybe hoped, the strangers in the streets seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were, too. A tiny man in a violet top hat had bowed to him once while out shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking Harry furiously If he knew the man, Aunt Petunia had rushed them out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking woman, all dressed in green, had waved merrily to him at once on the bus. A bald man in a very long purple coat actually shaken his hand on the street the other day and walked away without a word. The weirdest thing about all these people was they seemed to vanish the second Harry tried to get a closer look. At school, Harry had no one. Everybody knew that Dudley's gang hated the odd Harry Potter and his baggy clothes and his broken glasses, and nobody liked to disagree with Dudley's gang.